So this happened back around 2004 or so, when online dating wasn't as prevalent as it is nowadays. I had met and gone on a few dates with local guys, but nothing had come of it so far. One evening, as I was idly searching, I happened upon someone who was my age and had almost identical tastes in music, hobbies, and interests as me. I messaged him and we started chatting pretty quickly. He seemed interesting enough, so we agreed to meet up for coffee downtown. I didn't notice anything off-putting as we ordered our coffee and hung out for a while. We mostly talked about very mundane things. I found out he was a medical student at a local university. All in all, he seemed like a pretty normal guy. That is, until after we finished our coffee, and he told me he wanted to go for a walk around the city. It was around this time that I noticed his demeanor starting to slowly change. He seemed to grow very tense, and he got this gleam in his eye. He kept rubbing his hands over his thighs, as if to dry off his sweaty palms. He got very quiet as well. I started to get really nervous because of this. I also noticed that in our stroll together, he seemed to be leading me further and further away from the populated downtown area. All my attempts to continue conversation were met with half responses and mumbles from this now heavy-breathing, increasingly weird-acting guy. He was acting so strange that I suggested we needed to go back toward downtown. I turned around and started to go back the other direction when he reached out and grabbed my arm. "No, wait!" He half-breathed and half-mumbled. "We need to sit down. There's something important I need to tell you." Alarm bells were going off in my head like crazy. I knew I had to get away from this guy, but by this point we were far enough away from the downtown crowd there would be no one to come to my immediate aid. I numbly allowed him to guide us over to a bench and sit down. He held fast to my arm. He turned and stared at me, in a way I can only describe as a predator eyeing prey. He menacingly and proudly disclosed the fact he had been watching me for a very, very long time. He began to rattle off all this information he had been gathering about me. He knew which places my friends and I liked to hang out at. He liked to listen to me laugh in the background and talk with others. He would just hang in the crowd watching me. He knew where I lived. He knew where I worked, when I worked. He knew where I went to school and when I had my classes. He told me he had been following me for so long. That's when he finally found me on the dating site. He'd specifically tailored his profile to mirror mine so he could finally get me. Still clutching my arm, he slid his other hand over to squeeze my thigh. He told me that now that he had me, he was never going to let me go. The whole time this guy was rambling, I was acting nonchalant as I could, nodding like none of this was a big deal. Inside, I was obviously freaking out. As subtle as I could, I pulled out my phone and was texting my guy friends that I was in danger with one hand and I needed immediate help. One of them responded that he was in the area. He raced over to where I was right away. My heart was already pounding out of my chest when I saw my guy friend's truck pull up down the street. I waited until he was close enough to be in sight, and I ripped myself away from the grip of this creepy guy beside me. I started to run at my friend. The creepy guy chased after me, screaming obscenities. I could feel him gaining on me as I threw myself into the bed of my friend's truck. He sped away, the creepy guy still on the sidewalk shouting and swearing. That was the last time I fooled around with online dating. I have no idea what this guy's plan was, but I'd never been more terrified in my life. I was just home for Christmas and was reminded by my father of a story he'd told me once before. My father moved to Manhattan from Peru in 1970. One night during this time period, he was out at a bar with his friend Carlos, who was also from Peru. Sometime during the night, they were approached by this well-spoken, friendly, and nicely dressed American man. He offered to buy them a few rounds, and they spent some hours together drinking and talking. After a while, the man invited them back to his apartment, somewhere on the Upper East Side. He said this was to keep drinking and hanging out together. My father instantly and instinctively knew this was not a good idea, but Carlos, severely drunk and chasing more free drinks, stupidly insisted they take him up on it. They arrived at the apartment, and after an hour or so, Carlos had passed out altogether, sitting up in the man's reclining chair. Everything had been fine so far, but my dad was never comfortable with the idea and now knew there'd be even more complications with Carlos passed out. He was really stressing out at this point, so he went to the bathroom for a minute to splash some water on his face and sober himself up a bit. As soon as he stepped inside, he noticed a large pair of scissors sitting right on the sink. They were way larger than any normal household pair, kind of like the tools you'd see in a hospital setting. He told me that at this moment, his entire body was overtaken with instinct. Something inside him told him to pick up those scissors. He grabbed them and put them in the waist of his pants, right behind his back. When he walked back out into the living room, he found the man with his hand on Carlos's leg. He asked the man what he was doing and said they were leaving right now. The man told him to just relax and keep drinking, but enough was enough at this point. My father was leaving. At this point, the man's face dropped, his voice lowered, and his whole demeanor changed. "You are not going anywhere," was the man's reply. He produced a large knife. Upon this, my father pulled the scissors from behind his back and locked eyes with the man. They stood in a tense stalemate for a moment as my father called out to him, "I've got scissors and you've got a knife. If you come for me, I'm getting you too." The man realized the stalemate. He pointed the knife at my father for a moment more, then looked down and said, "Get the fuck out!" My dad shook Carlos awake, practically carrying him to his feet. He pushed him out the door, never taking his eyes off the man, nor his hands off that pair of scissors. As he left, the man stood in the door and glared at them as they backed down the hallway to the elevator. My mom was a single parent of 3 kids. We were pretty poor, so she worked pretty much 24/7. This meant that as kids, my siblings and I spent a lot of time home alone. Well, this story happened when I was 14, at the very start of summer. My older sister had moved out by then, and my little brother got sent to stay with my grandpa for the summer. This meant I was home alone from about 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. every weekday. I didn't really mind too much though. I spent most of that time playing Neopets or watching awful daytime TV. Well, one day, I had not long woken up, and my mom had gone to work hours earlier. It was around 12 p.m. or so. I got up to make some food, let my dog outside, and settled down on my bed to eat a bit. I remember watching Rock of Love, and remember exactly the bit of show I was watching too when this happened, even though it happened so many years ago. As I was sitting there watching, I heard a loud smack on my window. My window was a double window that needed 2 blinds, 2 curtains, etc. This meant there was a tiny gap where you could see through the very middle of them, where they didn't quite touch together. I saw a shadow along with that sound. I also heard some logs falling down. Outside my window, there was a pile of firewood for the winter. I got up and walked over, thinking perhaps a branch or something had smacked against it, and that's when I saw it. A huge handprint left on my window right where the tiny gap was between my blinds. I freaked the fuck out. I couldn't even breathe. I was so scared. I called 911 and then my next door neighbor, who was a family friend. He ran over as soon as I said what happened, and he found the guy there still, a man in his mid-40s, sprinting out of my backyard into the street ahead. My neighbor tried to keep him there until the police arrived. When they got there, I told them what happened. They looked into the guy to see if he had a past, but nothing seemingly came up. He had been dating and living with another neighbor 3 doors down from my house for a few months. When asked what he was doing at my window, he told us he was never there. He was just looking for something. I don't remember his exact excuse. I just remember him saying it happened to be in my backyard. The police got a statement from him, and the neighbor who caught him and myself thought it would help to get him put away or something. I know, it's stupid, but I was a teen. I didn't know any better. They just let him go and didn't do anything. I waited to hear from them regarding next steps we could take, but I never got another reply. From then on, my anxiety was awful. I had motion lights set up outside my window as well, making sure I was never sleeping alone too. But it wasn't enough. I could never rest. Now I felt like I was constantly being watched everywhere. Who knows, maybe I could have been. How did this guy know I would be home alone? What did he want to find me doing? I felt so unsafe. Fast forward 2 months later. I'm staying with my best friend who lived across the street from me, and we were both in the shower. We saw a shadow walk up to the bathroom window. It was glazed over, so you couldn't see anything properly. I wiped off some of the steam, and who do I see? That guy from my window the other time, running away from the bathroom as I popped it open. I told my friend who it was, and we both freaked out together. We called the cops again, and again they did nothing. Worst part was, no one even believed me, minus the guy who'd found him the first time. My mom told me I was too fat for a guy to want to creep on me, and that I was just being dramatic. Nothing happened to the guy. He did this multiple times after, and I have to wonder how many others he did it to as well. The woman he was living with had a very young daughter at the time too. It still haunts me, though I guess it shouldn't. It just scares me. We can go on with our lives, and someone could be watching and waiting to prey on us, and we would never know. What would he have done that night if he hadn't accidentally knocked the firewood logs over? I'll never know. First, I guess I should say that when I was growing up, my mom had a lot of undiagnosed mental health issues. One of the more minor things she suffered from was extreme anxiety and social awkwardness, but in this case, it had a significant impact on what would come. I must have been around the age of 8 to 10 years old. I can't remember exactly. We lived in a very small town in the north of Scotland, which also happened to be only a mile or so away from a sort of spiritual retreat that was fairly well known. And because we had this spiritual place so close to us, we would get a lot of, shall we say, weird people coming into town. Now, I don't mean to suggest that spiritualness always equals weirdness, but the reality is, it did attract a lot of strange people to the area. One day, I, my mom, and my little brother went up the high street to get some groceries, just a usual Friday afternoon. Outside the grocery store, just before making our way home, there was this guy with a large dog. Off the top of my head, I can't remember what breed it was, but it was one of those huge ones with the beautiful pure white fluffy fur. My brother and I were fascinated by it. The guy got to chatting with my mom for what seemed like an eternity. Eventually, she managed to get him to stop bothering her, and we started walking home. The guy with the dog had this van. Instead of just saying goodbye and going on his way, he shoved his dog in the back and proceeded to drive behind us at a pace slower than we were walking at. When we got home, he parked right outside our front door. When we got in, my mom shut the curtains and said to just ignore him. On Saturday morning, my brother and I got up early. When we peeked out the curtains, he was still there, standing with his dog right outside the wall to our garden and staring in through our living room window. It feels weird to even say this now, but honest to God, our mom made us turn off all the lights and crawl around so the guy would think we were not home. For the next 2 days, he stayed outside our house, coming up to our door, banging on it. When he got no response, he would come to the living room window and slam on that, shouting he knew we were home. He just wanted to be friends. Lots of things like that. Eventually, after almost a week of this, he finally fucked off. I know how weird it is now that my mom didn't just call the police or a friend for help, but I guess I can forgive her for suffering mental health issues at the time. As for the guy though, I have no idea what he was thinking doing all that shit. This happened when I was around 12 years old. It was in the middle of the night at my home. My dad would work the graveyard shift at work. Since it was the weekend, I had stayed up most of the night. It was somewhere between midnight and 1 a.m. My dad had told me to lock the doors and go to sleep, which I had done. I went to my room and finally fell to bed. After I went to my room, I'd only slept for about an hour though. At around 2 a.m., I was suddenly woken up to the sound of knocking on my back door. It scared me wide awake. After taking a few moments to process what I'd just heard, I decided it was probably just my dad knocking on the door. Maybe he'd forgotten something. Being mentally exhausted, I knew he had a house key on him. I told myself he'd just unlock the door on his own eventually. But the knocking continued. It was pretty creepy. Next thing I knew, the knocking had suddenly stopped. Then it started again at a different location. Someone was knocking on the window to my kitchen. I continued to try and assure myself it was just my dad. I didn't understand though. Why couldn't he just unlock the door himself? He always had the key on him. Thinking about this a bit more, I was starting to get pretty freaked out. I wasn't going to answer the door. If anything, my dad would eventually call me to open it for him. My phone was right next to me, but no such call ever came. The knocking started again at another window. I was terrified now, too scared to get up and check what was out there. The knocking would not stop. Next thing I know, it moved to the front door, and they began to slam at a harsher level too. That's when it hit me that I couldn't bring myself to move. I was frozen in fear. I couldn't bring myself to scream or talk or move any muscle. My heart was dropping as the knocking moved to a window closer and closer to my bedroom. My curtains were see-through. I couldn't do anything. I didn't know what I could do. I could only stay as my fear consumed me. I moved my eyes to the window. My heart skipped a beat when I saw a man peeking in through it, a tall man with a ski mask covering his face. I could hardly make out the details because it was so dark. His mask had some sort of skeleton design on it, and he tilted his head slightly as he noticed I'd seen him. I tried to say anything, but my words choked in my throat. I closed my eyes hard and started whispering to myself that it was not real, over and over again. I opened my eyes. No one was there. I breathed a sigh of relief until I heard a loud whisper from outside. "Open up or I'll cut you." Everything suddenly stopped. I could finally move again, but I couldn't really sleep anymore that night. It didn't feel like a dream. Everything felt so real. I don't know what happened, but I pray I'll never have to experience that again. It was one of the most frightening moments in my life I've ever dealt with. I couldn't find any trace of the guy after though. I was home alone that day too, so nobody could back me up. The following morning, I asked my dad when he came back from work if he'd come back earlier that day and knocked on my doors and windows. Of course, he did not. This happened to me when I was a child, and I still remember it very clearly to this day. It set me up for a lifelong fear of being watched as I slept. I was 6 years old, and my family and I were living in public housing, and we'd just recently come to America. Our apartment was on the first floor, but slightly underground. My bedroom window was level with the ground outside. The windows were really big. I had a ledge right next to my bed, which had my stuffed animals lined up and looking out the window. On this specific night, I was having a bit of trouble sleeping. There were these strange noises coming from outside my window, along with a rhythmic tapping. I peeped over to see what was happening, only to see a strange man crouching there, peeping through the gap between my curtains. He was looking directly at me, with the strangest look on his face. I started screaming and crying. My dad ran into the room to assure me that everything was okay and that I was just having a bad dream. I hadn't been sleeping though. I couldn't sleep that entire night. I had a weird feeling the whole night, as if I was being watched. My dad opened the curtains though, and nothing was ever there. To comfort me, he slept in my bed with me, but I still could not fall asleep. He, on the other hand, knocked out right away. It was getting later into the night when the weird noises started again. It sounded like someone trying to cut through the screen and tapping on the window with a blade as he cut through with that motion. I woke my dad up quietly, trying to show him what I'd told him about before. He ripped the curtains open, only to see the man there with a knife, cutting through the window screen. He jumped out of bed, ran for the door, and ran to chase the man who had been watching me sleep and trying to break into my room. He chased the man all the way to his car, but he sped off before my dad had a chance to confront him. My parents called the police and told them what happened, but nothing ever really came of it. From that night on, I had an irrational fear of sleeping by windows. I used to have night terrors about that incident for years. I hadn't thought about that for a while now, but recently I had another dream about it and couldn't stop thinking. I asked my dad about it recently and he refused to talk to me about it at all.